So today I sort of wanted to look at a case study that's recently come to my attention regarding how we basically erase male vulnerability to focus on how men are useful to women. If you remember from my previous video, I talked about how men have a single stat bar, a single public perception bar, which essentially just measures their usefulness to women. This article that I'm going to be referencing today as a case study in how we recast male vulnerability in terms of female utility. The article name is Knowing Women, Translating Patriarchy in International Criminal Law by Doris Buss, and it will be linked in the low bar. And the article references the Bosnian Genocide, in which Bosnian Serbs killed 8,000 Bosnian Muslim boys and men. So that's what this article is referencing, that particular genocide in history. First, I'm going to start by quoting some passages within the article, or this. I'm not even sure what to call it. It's not a study. It's just a bunch of random shit strung together. But anyway, I'm going to pull out some pertinent quotes. International courts and transitional justice institutions have recognized that gender and gender inequality produce certain kinds of gendered violence and victims during times of extreme conflict. Most commonly, this link between gender inequality and harm is found in the conclusion that rape in times of armed conflict is profoundly destructive to a community and a fate worse than death for women of traditional societies. The apparent willingness of some transitional justice institutions to recognize gender violence and inequality has been the subject of both feminist activism and critique. For many feminists, international criminal courts offer an arena where the gendered effects of armed conflict can be made more visible, thereby ending the historic erasure of women from the post-war accounting of violence and its effects. So this author is analyzing this massacre of over 7,000 boys, and they were selectively targeted to be killed. The women and the girls and the elders were not part of this genocide. She is discussing this situation in the context of gendered violence. Now, for most people who don't know what gendered violence means, what the phrase gendered violence means is violence targeted towards women. And it further means, the further implications of gendered violence, wherever it's used, is violence targeted at women because they're women. So that's what she means when she uses the phrase gendered violence. So when she looks at this conflict, she is looking at gendered violence, which is violence targeted at women because they're women. That's how they interpret the phrase gendered violence. Now, here's what she's finding. Here's the gendered violence against women that she's found in this particular situation. When these men were killed, women suffered things like that. They had trouble conducting business. They didn't know if they could marry again. They lost income from the men who died. And this loss of utility, these women who lost the utility of these men, this woman is saying that is gendered violence. That by killing these men, these women were selectively targeted. Now, I guess that logic works. I mean, you could think of a situation where someone really hates a farmer and selectively targets her fields to be burnt or her livestock to be killed, in which case, the person that hates the farmer is actually targeting the farmer. She's not targeting the livestock or the fields by burning them or killing them, right? But men and boys died in death camps. The rest were taken to internment camps. Now, because the women lost the utility of the men and boys who died, this woman is saying that's gendered violence against women. I mean, she'd probably justify it by saying the patriarchal nature of the Bosnian Muslim community left the women particularly vulnerable to having their male relatives and male members of their community killed. Because after they were killed, the roles that they occupied were no longer occupied, and women had to take them over, and it was difficult, and yada, yada, yada. But what she fails to recognize is the reason why those men were targeted for death in the first place was because of the so-called patriarchy. So, on the one hand, because of the patriarchy, women were more inconvenienced after the men died. But on the other hand, they were also spared from death. How much more clear-cut can it be that these people will never see in any way how men are vulnerable because they are men? These guys were targeted because men and boys were targeted because they were male. They were targeted for death because they were male. They were vulnerable to being targeted to death because they were male. But she can't see that as gendered violence. Instead, all she can see is how these men being killed, the women lost their utility. This is a really clear-cut case of the vulnerability of men being recast in terms of women's utility. These men have no existence outside of the utility of the women. No existence. It's simply, she cannot see how they were targeted as men. She cannot see how they were vulnerable as males to being targeted for death. She can't see how they were subject to gendered violence because she cannot see them outside of women's utility. I don't even know if this mentality is, if these people are even aware that they have this mentality, that they completely erase men's vulnerability and recast it in terms of women's utility. I don't know how much more clear-cut it could get, because literally she is saying that, literally, like these women, she's not pointing out any direct violence against these women as gendered violence. All she's doing is pointing out the effects of all these men dying as gendered violence against these women. I mean, how much more clear, how could you ever see gendered violence against men? I mean, if that isn't seen as gendered violence against men, but rather recast as gendered violence against women because they've lost the utility of those dead men, there is no situation on earth in which these people will see that men are being targeted, that men are vulnerable for being male. And like I said, I don't even know if they are aware that they have this mindset. Anyway, go take a look at the article. It's fascinating. It's actually, no, it's really confused, meandering, but you can pull out a few interesting reflections on the mindset of the author, of the feminist author.